Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Kathleen Brynsma, and I have the privilege of introducing our guest of honor, the author and justice activist Deepa Iyer. Since We Too Sing America was published last fall, Deepa has discussed her book from coast to coast in cities including Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, Los Angeles, and Seattle. So we're honored to bring her to Grand Rapids tonight. I have personally known Deepa for 22 years. Her story is the quintessential American story. Deepa was born in Kerala, India, and in 1985 she moved to Louisville, Kentucky with her parents and her younger brother. I met Deepa in the mid-90s when we were both first-year law students at the University of Notre Dame in our 20s. We studied contracts, criminal law, and corporations together. We were both student lawyers at the Notre Dame Legal Aid Clinic. We compared notes figuratively and literally on tax laws, professors, and the common threads that run through the world religions. We shared a passion for justice and public service as well. After our 1997 law school graduation, Deepa began her career at an Indianapolis law firm. But her passion for justice soon drew her to public service in Washington, D.C. Here are some highlights of Deepa's work. In 2000, Deepa joined the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. She was at the Department of Justice on September 11, 2001, and helped to create the department's initiative to address post-9/11 backlash against American Muslims, South Asians, Arabs, and Sikhs. In 2002, Deepa joined an Asian American nonprofit that worked to pass the District of Columbia Language Access Act of 2004 to remove language barriers to obtaining information and services from the DC government. In 2003, Deepa began to build, with nothing but her own vision, hard work, and persistence, the national nonprofit South Asian Americans Leading Together, or SALT. While at SALT, Deepa empowered Asian Americans to engage in our political system. And it was in her capacity as the director of SALT that Deepa facilitated President Obama's first meeting with Asian American national leaders to discuss immigration reform in 2013. Today, Deepa is the senior fellow at the Center for Social Inclusion, where she provides analysis, commentary, and scholarship on the ways we can build racial equity in light of the rapid demographic transformation in America's neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. She's taught as an adjunct professor at New York University, Hunter College, and the University of Maryland, and has written for the New York Times, The Nation, and The Guardian. In 2013, Deepa set out to pitch and write a book based on her work over the previous 10 years. We Too Sing America, South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh Immigrants Shape Our Multiracial Future, was published in the fall of 2015. And we can report that Deepa just received word that the book will also be published in paperback this coming fall, so congratulations for that. This book is essential, accessible reading for anyone who cares about our Constitution, the state of our union, and humanity. It's a chronicle of injustices by individuals and the state since 9/11, based on individuals' race, ethnicity, and faith. And it includes prescriptions for bringing about true equity, which will not appear simply because of our nation's imminent multiracial population, and which depends on all of us. Deepa's elegantly written stories of South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh people on the front lines before and since 9/11 will inspire anger, sadness, and also hope. This book has resonated across the country among people of all faiths and all races. While it addresses the struggles of certain groups, these are our brothers, sisters, neighbors, co-workers, and friends. Pursuing justice for them is up to each of us. While introducing Deepa at her book launch last fall, the Ford Foundation compared her to a modern-day Ella Baker. Baker was a 1960s civil rights activist who lifted up regular folks, empowered them to push for justice, and sought to bring women's voices to the forefront of the 1960s civil rights movement. The comparison of Deepa to Ella Baker is an apt one, because We Too Sing America is but the latest manifestation of Deepa's grit, elegance, compassion, and her lifting up of others, to which I've had a front seat since 1994. Just as Deepa's story is the quintessential American story, the issues she addresses and the issues we all have to work on are quintessentially American as well. In the wake of the horrible tragedy in Orlando over the weekend, we have to remember that the forces in our country that marginalize women, people of color, our LGBT brothers and sisters, immigrants, and the poor are the same forces that marginalize South Asians, Muslims, Arabs, and Sikhs. So we must stand up and work together and stand together in our work for justice and safety for all. In her book, Deepa, whose name means light and lamp in Hindu, shows us some ways in which we can do exactly that. So it's my distinct pleasure and my honor to introduce my friend, the author and justice activist, Deepa Iyer.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Oh, you can do better than that. Good evening. That's great. That's great. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And I want to first thank the Progressive Women's Alliance for coordinating this program, to the board members who put this together, and for inviting me. The work that you all do to lift up the voices of people in power and people in politics is especially critical, especially at this time in our nation's history. And I want to thank Noreen, Ellen, and all the other sisters, women who drive this organization so that all of us can live in a more inclusive democracy. And before I get started, I also, of course, want to send a special thank you to my dear friend Kathleen Bruinsma, who, you're always worried when a good friend introduces you because you don't know exactly what they might say about you and reveal. But at the same time, of course, Kathleen, I think, overdid her introduction. I have had the privilege of being on a life journey with my sister Kathleen since our time in law school together. And as you all know in the community, her integrity, her compassion, especially to those who are most marginalized and on the margins, and her clear-eyed vision to make change as a public servant and a leader is something that she has had since law school. And I am so proud to be part of her journey, and she's an inspiration to me and so many others as well. So thank you, Kathleen. That is why it's also a greater honor for me to be here in Grand Rapids tonight, to be with all of you. So as Kathleen mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the themes in my book, which I hope that you'll have a chance to take a look at, and I'll read a few passages as well. But I'm most excited and looking forward to the dialogue that we'll have afterwards. And if any of you are people on social media, please feel free to tweet using the hashtag #WeTooSingAmerica. So while Kathleen told you a little bit about my life history, I want to start by actually telling you about my point of entry into not just the United States, but into the work that I do. I was born and raised, as Kathleen mentioned, in Kerala, India, and moved with my parents and younger brother to, of all places, Louisville, Kentucky, when I was 12. And growing up in Kentucky in the mid-1980s was definitely a time of oftentimes confusion for me. At the time in Kentucky, race was framed along a black or white racial binary or framework. And so for someone like myself, who was an immigrant from India, who was raised in a Hindu household, it was unclear as to where I fit in and what kind of boxes that I should check from an ethnic or religious or racial standpoint. Thankfully, over the years, I was able to develop my consciousness as a woman of color and as an immigrant more clearly when I went on to law school and pursued higher education. But it was really, for me, the moments and the weeks after the attacks of September 11th that really became a call to action. At the time of 9/11, I was working as an attorney at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and as I talk about in my book, many of us who are from South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh communities really went through a process of double grieving. Grieving for the horrific acts of violence that had occurred on that day when so many people lost their lives to senseless violence, but also grieving for the acts of discrimination and hatred that we began to see among members, targeting members of our own communities who were being scapegoated for what had happened on 9/11. This is actually a picture that was taken about 4 or 5 days after the attacks, when a number of civil rights activists gathered at the Japanese American Memorial in Washington, D.C., to send a message of unity to our nation, to send a message of a reminder, really, to not repeat the mistakes that our nation had made during the internment of Japanese Americans. And shortly thereafter, I began to work very deeply in the South Asian American community. There are about 3.4 million South Asians living all around the United States, coming from countries such as India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and others. And at the time that the attacks occurred, we actually did not have any sort of national voice. The attacks and the discrimination that happened afterward became a wake-up call for my community. And thankfully, I was able to use the privileges that I had been able to gain through my education, in particular, to step into that moment and to have the privilege of leading an organization called SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, which is a national nonprofit in Washington, D.C. that advocates on issues of civil rights and immigration. And it was really the experiences that I had at SALT that led me to want to document the stories of my community, stories that we often don't hear, stories that are often told about us but not by us. And so We Too Sing America is a way to document and chronicle both the injustices that our communities have endured in the last 15 years, but also the ways in which we continually stand up to resist those injustices, the ways in which we reshape America and the American landscape. So there are a couple of goals for why I wrote the book. One of them is actually to fill in some gaps that many in the American public have about what it means to live in post-9/11 America. I often teach college at the University of Maryland, and I noticed that many of my college students had a very sanitized and incomplete understanding of what the post-9/11 American landscape is. And so this book was written to fill in some of those gaps. But it's also written with an eye towards the future. While it looks back to 9/11 and the 15 years after 9/11, it looks forward as well. It looks forward to a time when, as Kathleen alluded to, the racial demographics all around the United States are quickly changing. And it asks the question, and this is a question that I actually wanted all of us to be thinking about today: why must we and how do we foster inclusive, safe, welcoming, and equitable communities that reflect today's racial realities, that reflect today's racial landscape? And that is the question that I think is critical for all Americans, regardless of our faith, our background, our socioeconomic class, and our race, to be considering at this moment today. So in order to do that, I wanted to spend a few moments looking at where we're heading, right? What are we actually talking about when we think about the racial landscape and how it is shifting? So as this particular graphic shows us from the Creighton School of Law, we are heading to a point by the time we hit 2040 that is known as the tipping point for when the demographics will completely shift in the United States. It's already happening in different parts of the country, but 2040 is when we'll have this national picture actually emerge, where people of color and communities of color will comprise the majority population in the United States. And that, of course, has a lot of ramifications and consequences as well. If we look at census data, we can see here, this is comparing between 2000 and 2010, that there are two communities that are really driving the demographic growth: the Asian American community, which is a very diverse community to begin with, and the Latino community. Asians are driving the demographic growth primarily because of immigration patterns, and Latinos are driving this growth because of more babies being born in the United States. And as we also know, the United States still remains as a world leader when it comes to being a destination for immigrants. We know from, for example, the Pew Research Center that 55% of the population growth between 1965 and 2015 actually occurred because of the immigration patterns in this country. And it's important to note that today, or more recently, I should say, Black immigrants are also driving this immigration growth that is, again, led by Latino and Asian American communities. But we don't have to wait till 2040 to see how these demographic changes are actually playing themselves out. In 2014, the Federal Department of Education released data, this is a graph that shows that showed that in 2014, For the first time in American history, there were more students of color entering public schools in this nation than ever before. And so we know this as we look at our schools, as we look at workplaces, as we look at our neighborhoods, that really the racial demographics are shifting in a way that we have not seen before. And each of us, I think, experiences that in our own ways. For me, it has primarily been when I have seen and visited my child's classroom. He's the far one to the right over there, or my right. And when he started kindergarten, I noticed how his classroom was very, very different than the classrooms that I had gone to in Kentucky, of course, many years ago. So as we think about creating a safe, inclusive democracy for all communities, right? Communities of color, for white communities, for multiracial communities, for immigrants and refugees, some of what we need to also be aware of are the racial realities that are bound to occur. And we are in the midst of some of those. These racial realities include messages like these, where we will hear that race is behind us, that race no longer matters, that we are in a post-racial environment, right? We will also begin to hear, this is a National Journal poll that hopefully you can read it in the back. We will also hear different expectations for the changing America. For example, this poll shows that there are many people who are not actually very excited about the changing demographics, right? They feel that the true America is going away, whatever that true America is, right? That it is being changed due to the influx of immigrants, due to the influence of communities of color. And some of that shows up in policy, some of it shows up in political discourse or in media discourse. So unfortunately, many of us have become accustomed to seeing signs such as these, where there are the policies or language or rhetoric that is really about becoming inward, about being insular, about creating a dividing line about who is American and who is not, right? Who belongs in the United States and who is part of the other, which goes counter to all of our values, I would say, of diversity and multiculturalism and inclusion. And we are also seeing this backlash in terms of an erosion of rights, from the voting booth to bathrooms, from the greater muscle of a law enforcement state that is affecting many communities of color and immigrants in this country, and of course, in the form of Islamophobia and xenophobia, which is what I want to speak with you in depth about. So this is what we are already seeing as the demographics shift in the United States, which for many of us is a welcoming trend. We are also seeing a backlash, an erosion of rights, and messaging that is restricting who belongs and who does not. So I want to take a little bit of time to pause here to remind us all, I think everyone in this room knows, that just because the numbers shift, just because there are greater population numbers, say for people of color in the United States, that racial inequity does not automatically disappear. Numbers do not translate into political power or economic power. And if we look at every indicator of success in the United States, if we look at income levels or access to education, access to healthcare or other such benefits, access to housing, access to water rights, we know that people of color, immigrants, and refugees continue to have less opportunities, fewer benefits, and less access to these sorts of rights and benefits in the first place. So again, to recap, more numbers in one sense creates a diverse America, but it does not necessarily translate into political or economic power or even the ability to enforce rights that everyone should have. And so again, I bring us back to that question of, if we all want to create a truly inclusive democracy, what must we do? And we'll talk about that throughout the presentation and hopefully in dialogue as well. But I want to take a little bit of time to focus in on one of the ways in which we have seen this backlash occur, and that is through Islamophobia and xenophobia. So just in terms of making sure we're all on the same page, the way that I talk about Islamophobia is the perception that anyone who is Muslim or perceived to be Muslim is either a terrorist or a terrorist in waiting, or in other words, a national security threat. That is what Islamophobia actually translates itself to in terms of policy and the impact on people. Xenophobia is anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-refugee sentiment. So for the past 15 years, Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and Sikh immigrant communities have really been on the front lines of receiving the brunt of racial anxiety, Islamophobia, and xenophobia. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk to you about how that plays itself out. There are 3 ways I talk about in my book about how these trends have been coming together and how they have been inflicting a lot of harm on the communities that I work with very closely. One of the ways in which it shows up that many of us know is through one-on-one bias and one-on-one discrimination. So that looks like hate violence, for example. This is a picture of the brother of Balbir Singh Sodhi. Mr. Sodhi was the first man to be killed, first person to be killed after 9/11. He was a gas station owner planting flowers for the victims of 9/11 outside of his gas station when someone came by and shot him and said, "This is for 9/11." He's a turbaned Sikh man, and he became one of the first victims of the post-9/11 backlash. Unfortunately, hate violence in our communities is not limited to the days and weeks after the 9/11 attacks. You might recall seeing this picture on the news. This is a picture of 3 young Arab students who were killed in North Carolina just about a year and a half ago. Again, for their appearance, they're Muslims. Beyond hate violence against people, our communities also endure hate violence against our institutions, the safest, most sacrosanct of places of worship. So whether it's mosques like this one, or Hindu temples like this one outside of Seattle, Washington, with the sign "Get Out" painted on it, or in gurdwaras, which I'll talk about in a little bit later, we continually see those sorts of attacks and vandalism against our places of worship. And lastly, individual discrimination shows up as we do very routine, mundane things like taking a plane. This is a picture of Waris Ahluwalia, who's a Sikh-American actor in the United States who was banned from boarding a plane because, again, he was suspected of being a threat. He wears a turban and has a long beard. Or the mundane act of going to school. This picture you may recognize as well. This is Ahmed Mohammed, who was a Muslim teenager, a black Muslim teenager in Irving, Texas, who had brought in a homemade clock as a science experiment to school. And he was immediately suspected of actually being a national security threat or a threat to the school, and was put in juvenile detention, arrested and put in juvenile detention. So the ways in which this plays out, where our communities are afraid of going to our places of worship or even participating in activities such as going to school, making science experiments, or boarding a plane, has had tremendous consequences on the way that we live, on the decisions that we have to make day after day in order to protect our safety and that of our families. But one-on-one discrimination is not the only way in which we have seen this backlash manifest in the 15 years after 9/11. The second way is through state laws and state policies. So as you all know, the United States has been involved in a war on terror, both abroad and here domestically. And as a result of that, we have seen policies that have actually arbitrarily detained, targeted, and deported many of our community members. This is a picture of 2 women holding up names of people that they call the disappeared, because these men actually disappeared from their homes and their workplaces, and they have no idea where they went. It also includes policies like surveillance. Praying while Muslim is not a crime. It shouldn't be, but unfortunately, we know, for example, that law enforcement agencies such as the New York Police Department routinely send in informants into mosques or to spy on the activities of Muslim students associations on college campuses, or to even profile people who are playing cricket and soccer games in public parks in Brooklyn and Queens. All documented. And one wonders, right, when the state itself is pursuing policies like these, it creates an environment of fear that naturally other people are going to buy into. And then thirdly, the last way in which the post-9/11 backlash manifests is through media and political discourse. And while the sounds of and images of these words are louder and louder today than they have been before, our communities actually know that they have been happening for quite some time. We have been hearing this at the state level and the national level for over 15 years. And at the end of the day, the message that we get over and over, day after day, is that it is not our country. Despite the fact that many of our communities have been in this country for over 100 years, that we are still seen as outsiders, as perpetual foreigners, and as the new other. and that is the climate that we have had to contend with. And so I want to take a moment actually to read to you a couple of passages from my book that illustrate this sort of climate that I'm talking about. And I'm going to read to you from the first chapter. It is on a massacre that occurred in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, that many of you might be familiar with. Oak Creek is a small city outside of Milwaukee. It was early on a Sunday morning in August 2012, and Paramjit Kaur Saini was going about her morning routine. Her sons, 20-year-old Kamal and 18-year-old Harpreet, wanted to sleep in a little bit longer. So Paramjit set out on her own to the local Gurdwara, the Sikh temple of Wisconsin. Paramjit was a familiar presence at the Gurdwara, which had become a second home to her family and to many other Sikhs in Oak Creek, which is a small city located in the outskirts of Milwaukee. The Gurdwara, built in 2007 on 13 acres of land by Sikh immigrant families, sits a few miles from the Milwaukee airport. On weekends, Sikh families gathered at the Gurdwara to pray and connect with one another. The dining hall was always filled with the sounds of people socializing and children laughing during langar, which is a free meal offered to anyone who came to the Gurdwara. Kamal and Harpreet usually hung out with their friends and played football, while their mother helped in the kitchen and the prayer hall. But August 5th, 2012 would not turn out to be a normal Sunday for Paramjit's family or for the Oak Creek community. Soon after his mother had left the house, news reached Kamal that people inside the Sikh temple of Wisconsin were in danger. Details were scarce, and panic-stricken, Kamal rushed to the Gurdwara to find that law enforcement vehicles had blocked off the driveway. Authorities asked him to wait across the street in the parking lot of a bowling alley, where he joined others also anxiously searching for information. While waiting there, Kamal and others speculated about what might be happening inside the Gurdwara. They wondered, did a dispute between community members go awry? Then their close friend Kirandeep received a call from her father. He was inside the Gurdwara. He whispered to her that he was hiding in the pantry of the kitchen because he had heard gunshots. He was one of around 25 people, huddled, terrified, among bags of rice and fresh vegetables. As the day wore on, many of the people who had been inside were allowed to leave, and a fuller picture began to emerge about the rampage that had occurred at the Gurdwara that Sunday morning. Not seeing his mother and becoming increasingly anxious about her safety, Kamal left the parking lot. He called his friends, and together they went from hospital to hospital, hoping that Paramjit had been brought to one. It would be a full 11 hours before authorities finally notified Kamal that his mother had been one of 6 people fatally shot inside the Gurdwara. When I first found out, I passed out, Kamal told me. I woke up in an ambulance and immediately thought of my little brother. Telling him was the hardest thing I have ever done. This was not the future that Paramjit had envisioned for her family when she and her 2 sons moved to America from India in 2004 to join her husband, who owned a number of gas stations in Wisconsin. And it was not the life that Paramjit had planned to build when she mustered up the courage a few years later to begin working at a medical factory in a nearby town. Paramjit's determination to care for her family is a point of deep pride for her sons, Kamal and Harpreet. 45 days after his mother was killed, Harpreet spoke about her in testimony before the United States Senate. He said, "My mother was a brilliant woman, a reasonable woman. Everyone knew she was smart, but she never had the chance to get a formal education. She couldn't. As a hardworking immigrant, she had to work long hours to feed her family, to get her sons educated, to help us achieve our American dreams. This was more important to her than anything else. But now she's gone because of a man who hated her because she was not his color or his religion. She was an American, but this was not our American dream." So I'm going to just pause there for a moment and ask for just a moment of silence for the community in Oak Creek, and remembering also that it is not only Oak Creek, but it is also Orlando that is suffering tonight because of gun and hate violence. So if you'll just join me for just a moment. Thank you. The rest of that particular chapter in the book talks about how the Oak Creek community responded to this horrific act of violence that occurred when a man who was affiliated with white supremacist organizations barged into the Gurdwara on a Sunday morning and killed 6 people and terrorized the entire community. This happened just in 2012. And so how does a community respond? How does law enforcement and government agencies and the nonprofit and philanthropic sector come together to take a stand against hate violence? That has happened in Oak Creek, and it has served to be a model for other communities all around the nation. And the rest of the book is also filled with stories of young people in particular who are at the front lines of this sort of backlash, whether it is hate violence, as Kamal was when his mother was killed inside the Gurdwara, or whether it is Droost, who's a young woman, it's hard to see her picture right there at the bottom, who is a Kurdish Muslim refugee living in Nashville, Tennessee, and who has been on the front lines of responding to a virulent strain of backlash that we have seen there, both in the legislature, but also on the streets and in places of worship against immigrant communities and Muslim communities. And it involves young people like Eves, who is an undocumented Indian American living in Maryland, who had to see and watch his parents get deported because of immigration policy in this nation, and who has been lending a voice as one of the dreamers, who is talking up and speaking out about his experiences. So these young people and their resistance and their ability to counteract the hate and vitriol that their families and they themselves face is really what animates the book. And this sort of organizing is happening all around our communities. As we face the backlash, we are also able to disrupt and build bridges as well. Whether it is young women in our communities who are standing up to say that we are not your model minority, that is a reference to a common theme that is usually talked about with Asian Americans, where people have these perceptions that we are all highly educated and all spelling bee champions and all Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. And the ability to disrupt that narrative because it is A, not accurate, but B, it creates wedges between us and other people of color as well. Or whether it is young people, again, talking about and putting their sexual orientation and their immigration status on the line, as Bhupin does in this picture, no relief, no education. Or young people in Jackson Heights, New York City, who are organizing across class to talk about issues of profiling and racism. These are the pictures that are emerging in our communities around solidarity with the movement for Black lives, solidarity with immigrants and refugees, and of course with each other as we reshape the American landscape. So I want to end by talking a little bit about prescriptions, as Kathleen mentioned, the what next, what can we each do, right? And to really think about building an inclusive democracy, it is going to take all of us. It will take progressive white people, it will take multiracial folks, it will take people of color and immigrants and refugees of all ages and generations. And I think often about Dr. King's message around the fierce urgency of now, this belief that we cannot wait anymore for others to fix what is going wrong in our communities, right? That we have to be the ones that step up. And I created this mnemonic to help us think about it called BUILD. And I think that within BUILD are some of the building blocks for understanding how we can actually best create safer, more inclusive democracies and communities in our nation. So the B is bridges of acceptance and respect, the ability for us to actually understand that we share common values and common hopes for the future, regardless of where we come from or who we are. The U is to understand that we also have a shared history in this nation of values around inclusion and justice and equality and opportunity that everyone connects to. The I is to inform and be informed. As I mentioned earlier, many of us have very incomplete understandings of each other's own histories or each other's oppressions. So the ability to actually understand and be informed and then inform others is critical. The L stands for leading with language, the language of solidarity, the language of acceptance. And then D, my favorite word, is disrupt, respectfully, of course. Disrupting the status quo, disrupting the ways in which narratives usually function in our country, in our society, and actually changing them and taking a stand about them. So some examples of how we do this, some concrete examples around, for example, changing language, moving from the conversation of calling people minorities to talking about people of color, from illegal to undocumented when we refer to immigrants who don't have status in this nation, and even thinking about how we think about shifting social change theory. Oftentimes we have heard that we have to do the work that is individual, right? We have to address our implicit biases that we all hold about each other. And that's where the work is. And it is true, that is where the work is. But it is also about changing systems, laws, institutions, and policies, because we cannot actually create the long-term transformative changes in our society if we don't do both of these things. And as we know, and we talk about this a lot at the organization I work at, the Center for Social Inclusion, there are 3 levels of racism. And you could take the word racism and put other words there, such as gender inequity or sexism or homophobia or Islamophobia. It all works the same way. There's that individual racism, but there's institutional and structural racism. And oftentimes in the United States, we actually only get to the individual racism, and we don't do a great job at that either. But we have to actually start to fix the structural and institutional pieces. And then lastly, moving from the language of just talking about diversity and multiculturalism, which are again American values, to moving towards inclusion, access, and justice. And as we think about this, when we think about the importance of having teachers of various races and backgrounds in a particular school, that is an important value to reach for and an important practice to reach for. But unless the school changes its structural policies around teacher training or puts in place anti-bias policies or anti-bullying policies, things will not materially change for children of color or immigrant children or refugee children. So how do we actually move from value to practice is something that I think will be critical for us as we think about the changing landscape. And this picture, which I'm sure many of you have seen, demonstrates this quite well, right? The value of equality is something that we all believe in, where these three young people want to watch the baseball game, but not all of them can see it. But we want them to, because we think they all should be equal, and they are equal. And equity, though, is what we should lean into, the practice that we should have, so that we actually give the shortest person the building blocks that he or she needs in order to actually be able to watch the game. So how do we move from the value of equity and the principle of equality to the practice of equity? That, I think, is a key critical question that all of us need to be thinking about. So finally, just some best practices from other communities all around the nation in the political sphere, given the Progressive Women's Alliance's bent. A few kinds of different ways in which we're talking about practices are emerging. So how does a city, for example, have an impact assessment? Does it have an impact assessment in place when it thinks about its policies? So where there's a policy around housing access or education access, making sure that there's an evaluation on how communities of color are being affected by that policy is a critical tool that government agencies, for example, could use. Targeted electoral outreach to communities of color and newly naturalized citizens. I don't have the data on me off the top of my head, but as we know, more and more communities of color and immigrant communities are becoming a big part of the American electorate, right? The new American majority, for example. And so the importance of targeting outreach to them is especially important. Fostering political participation by people of color. Again, very important when we think about how to best address the needs of different communities. There's a wonderful organization called the New American Leaders Project, a national organization that does this, where they cultivate and train leadership among immigrants and communities of color to run for office at all levels, but especially at the local level. And lastly, pledging to do and engage in race talks and practices around race. I talk a lot about this in my book, the importance of actually not shying away from the word race and to actually engage in a race talk, whether that's within our family member structures or whether that's in conversations like this, that we have to actually be able to name it in order to address it properly. And with that, I'm going to ask my friend Annie to pass out some postcards to all of you, because I'm asking you, as I ask in the book, to be disruptors and bridge builders in your own right. And the postcards that Annie's passing out, on the back of them, allow you to actually take a pledge of action. So if anything that you have heard tonight, that I've talked about, that Kathleen talked about, that I read from in the book has moved you in any way to take action, I ask you to take a pledge and write it out. And I think we have some pens perhaps going around as well. And what I would like you to do is think about it, write it out, and then actually give it back to me, because I hope to meet each of you in person. Give it back to me by putting your email address on it and your mailing address. And in a couple of months, I will mail it back out to you to remind you of your pledge and to send along any resources that I can that might be useful. So what have people said in the past? This is just a little bit, some small examples of what different types of people have said, depending on where, who they're connected to, their networks, and what they feel they have the capacity to do in terms of engaging on issues of race, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and inclusion. So some people have said, I will have conversations with family members about Islamophobia, and that is really hard to do. The conversations we have at our dinner tables are the messiest and most difficult ones to have. I will join local activities of Surge, standing up for racial justice, to understand how to be a better white ally. I will demonstrate via my church or association or school that I support immigrants, refugees, and Muslim communities. For example, I have seen, and been so inspired. Most recently, this is the holy season of Ramadan for Muslims, as most of you know, and there have been so many churches that have actually put up signs saying, we love our Muslim neighbors during Ramadan. And those sorts of expressions actually mean a great deal to our communities who often feel isolated in the United States. Or I will write letters to the editor of the local paper expressing my values about an inclusive multiracial community. Or ask my elected leaders to take a pledge to refrain from using divisive rhetoric. These are just some of the ways in which people have responded to those pledge cards, and I hope that you'll take the time to do that as well, because as we've been talking about here, it will take each one of us to take a stand against any sort of vitriolic rhetoric, but also actions and policies in our country in order to build a nation that is safe, that is welcoming, and that is inclusive for every single one of us. So with that, I want to leave you with a couple of images that I think reflect that for me in particular. This actually is from my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, where a mosque in Louisville was vandalized right after the attacks in Paris. You can see a little bit of that there. This is for France last November. And rapidly, within a week, the mayor of Louisville, people from all around the city, including some students from my own alma mater high school, Sacred Heart Academy, went to the mosque and cleaned it, took off the signage, and actually came together in a demonstration of unity and support, which has continued to this day. And this taking us back to Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Every single August, there's a memorial for the 6 victims of the tragedy. And this past August last year, when I was in Oak Creek, I noticed that the children of Oak Creek were also holding pictures of African Americans who had been killed at the church in South Carolina a few months before, to show again that solidarity and the ability to reach across racial lines, both in pain, but also in terms of looking to the future, of supporting each other and being in solidarity with one another. So with that, I want to thank you for listening. I hope that you'll make your pledge, and there's more information and resources on my website, which is up there. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation and hope that we can have a dialogue about what is happening in Grand Rapids and how we can create together inclusive communities here and, of course, all across the nation. Thank you.
We're going to take 6 questions. There are microphones down at the end of either aisle. If you have a question, please feel free to line up to ask it. And while I'm waiting for folks who want to come and ask questions, I have one for myself. How do I talk to family members who do feel that anxiety, even though they themselves are children of immigrants, they feel, how do I respond to the notion that waves of immigration equal bad changes? How do I respond to that in a calm way over turkey?
So, as I said, the conversations with family members and friends are often the hardest to have because we try to ignore, topics of politics and race and the like. But I think in terms of your question on immigration, but I think that it can be used in terms of other issues as well. I would say two things. I think it's really important to center, as you mentioned, what someone else's experience has been, and to remind ourselves that we too have endured certain forms of discrimination and bias, right? And I think it's very clear in the immigration context. I mean, if we look back, Catholics were discriminated, Catholic immigrants were discriminated against in this country. Polish, Italian, Jewish immigrants have been discriminated against in this country. In fact, the first English-only laws in this nation, which we don't really need because English is the official language, but the first English-only laws in this country actually came into place to stop people from speaking Polish. And so this is a trajectory that we have seen in the United States, right? So people have some connection of understanding that anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-immigrant laws in this nation have affected them or their ancestors in some way. So the first is to center those experiences. And then the second is actually to lead with stories. I feel that you mentioned the word humanity when you were doing your introduction, Kathleen, and I think that's exactly on point. When we connect to the humanity of each other, then these sorts of barriers can move away. And so that's why I read the story of the family in Oak Creek, because every time I read that, I see people who are not Sikh connect immediately to what that story is. So I think the more stories we can tell about Muslim, Arab, South Asian, Sikh communities to each other can be a gateway to really kind of expanding people's minds as well. Because a lot of these reactions are coming from fear of something being taken away. And so when we actually start from another place of, well, we're kind of in it together, and there have been similar experiences that we've had, and here's a story that illustrates that, I think people open up. But you'll have to let me know how that goes at your next turkey dinner.
So, Deepa, thank you very much for coming. You use your platform, your background as an immigrant child to talk about immigrant issues and discrimination that newcomers, especially newcomers of color, have faced. In working with immigrants and trying to advocate for rights, I'm starting to hear some pushback from folks of color who have been oppressed for, let's say centuries here, and saying, well, wait, what's all this advocacy, this new advocacy, what about us? And are we getting left behind? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that a lot of that not understanding each other also comes from this sense that we are in a time of scarcity in the United States. There's a language of scarcity, or this perception of scarcity that oftentimes I think infuses a lot of the rhetoric. And so I think what you're alluding to is, for example, we have seen the lack of connection or tensions between, say, African American communities and immigrant communities who might be coming from Asia or Latin American countries, right? And that's not at all something that's happening across the board, but sometimes those tensions come up because there's this sense of immigrants being job takers and job stealers, or taking away what belongs in a particular community because they're coming in. Those images of Americas being invaded, that is not just in terms of a war at all. It's actually it's an economic proposition that they're coming in to take our jobs, they're coming in to change our culture. So that sort of tension exists, and it is often used to pit communities against each other. So anti-immigrant advocates usually use that rhetoric to, for example, pit African American communities against Asian American communities, right? And so one of the things that we have to do is to call that out when we hear it, to actually again show that and we know this, that immigrants contribute to this country in large, significant ways and always have, right? And right now, many of the immigrants in this country are doing jobs that a lot of Americans don't want to do. They're working class communities, they're at the back of the restaurant, they are janitors, they are domestic workers, right? And so we have to understand that these are not people that are taking things away. They're actually contributing to this country. And we have to really call out the rhetoric that we hear to pit communities against each other. And I think that is happening more and more. So I'll just quickly say that one organization that I think is doing tremendous work is called BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which is a nonprofit organization that builds bridges between Black communities and immigrant communities who are Latino and Asian. So those sorts of initiatives are happening all around the nation to create those bridges of understanding I talked about, but also to push for and advocate for better immigration policies that will actually help all Americans as a whole. And by the way, that was Alan Hedblum who spoke, and if you haven't heard his show, you should watch it.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was struck by the slide that has the circle diagrams about changing demographics, and the larger population of white people was represented in the blue. And by the time you got to 2040, it had half white, and the other half was broken up into different colors. And I feel concerned, and I have trouble talking with people when I hear them say, by 2040, or later, whites are going to be a minority. And I looked at that diagram and I thought, well, that means whites and all you other folks. And it's really a misrepresentation. And so I think that comes from a statement of fear. People fear change. And it's hard to get over, it's hard to get to people. How do you deal with people who are talking from a position of fear and gut, as opposed to thinking, well, look at that diagram. It's all these other people of different colors, and there's still this large group of whites who are still majority.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you for your question. Yeah, I think that this concept of the majority-minority population unfortunately scares some people, because it is not to say that the white population will no longer exist. It's just to say that we'll have a balanced population in the United States due to immigration patterns, due to more births in the United States of people of color, right? And so I think part of it is, one, to go back to the values that I think our nation was founded on, that we still believe in, the values of diversity, the values of having people from different backgrounds shape this democracy. And all that it shows is that we are actually living up to our destiny, our demographic destiny in the United States. We've put into place immigration policies, for example, that have welcomed people. Some of them have been restrictive policies, but for the most part, since 1965, we have opened up our immigration laws. And so it's not surprising to see these demographic changes. So I think for people who are often surprised by it, I talk about how this has been a long time coming, and there are reasons that it is happening, right? And some of those reasons go back to our belief in creating a diverse democracy in the United States. The second is the fear part. And I really think that underlies most of the barriers that we see in this country. The concept that people are taking things away from us, that we are going to lose the true nature of what America is, the politics of scarcity rather than abundance. Those talking points are what we continually hear in the United States. And so how do we push back against that? Well, actually, I think to build another set of talking points that we amplify, where we talk about the values of diversity and inclusion, where we talk about how, from a factual basis, immigrants and refugee communities are contributing to this country in economic ways, political ways, cultural ways, right? So I think that the only way to combat that sort of fear is actually to start from a place of love and talk about the values that our country was founded on. It sounds a little bit, I know, hokey, but I actually think it's the truth. And that's the message that I feel not everyone will agree with, because it's hard to overcome fear. But I think the more people, again, of different backgrounds, and I really, want to amplify that the demographic changes in this country and creation of an inclusive democracy is going to be so highly dependent on white allies joining the movement for change. And so I can say this all I can, but when you say it, it actually will have more of an impact, especially on people who might be white and might have some of those fears. And so to be part of this conversation, an active part of this conversation, I always ask white allies to do that or find a way to do that, because it is extremely important that we have a range of voices presenting these messages.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And it's very important how timely this discussion is. You showed a picture of your beautiful son. So could you tell us some stories about your children and some of life experiences that they have had? And because many of us, I'm a retired teacher, and I have 2 grandchildren, and I spend a lot of time with a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and times are tough. So maybe some people here would like to hear stories of how you have conversations with children, your children, or others. Thank you.
About these issues?
Yes.
Thank you. I think that's one of the questions I get asked a lot when I do these discussions, which is how do we have the talk with our children about some of these thorny issues? And it is not easy to have those conversations. Black families have been having these conversations with their children for decades about what it means to encounter law enforcement. I think that Muslim, Arab, South Asian communities have been having these conversations over the last 15 years since 9/11 about our names, right? Or speaking in a different language in public or on an airplane. Sadly, these conversations have actually become more about the parameters of behavior that is acceptable in America now and what not to do. Those are the types of conversations that our families, unfortunately, are having with our own children. But I think, for a 6-year-old, 8-year-old of any kind of background or race, I don't think that it is too early to start talking about race. And I don't know how to do it very well, of course, either. I'm still learning with my son, who's 6. But I have noticed that he has certain kinds of experiences, or he talks about skin color quite a bit. He will come home and say something like, I'm really brown, and there aren't that many brown people, other brown kids in my class, or something like that. And whenever he makes a comment about race, even though he doesn't know he's talking about it, I seize the opportunity to actually open up a discussion about what that means, right? So, well, how does it feel for you to be in your brown skin? And then reinforce that that's beautiful and that's important, and he should feel really proud of it. And then talk about, what about the other children in your classroom, right? So to kind of use any sort of statements that I think young children say to open up a broader conversation. And it doesn't have to be about all of this that I talked about. But I think, again, to go back to the values of, you're in a really great school where there are, so many children of all these different backgrounds. And you all have very similar experiences. So to kind of push forward those themes of inclusion and acceptance at a very young age, I think is critical. I don't think that we allow conversations about race in our schools enough. I don't think that we allow them in our families enough, and I think that's one of the reasons it's become like a taboo topic. And it bubbles up at certain times in our nation's history, as it has been more recently. And so the importance of, again, having the race talk, however it is that you can have it with your children or grandchildren, is very meaningful. And the last thing I'll say really quickly is there are a lot of books now, children's books, that allow those conversations to happen. We read a book often, I can't remember, I think it's like From Turmeric to Tan or something like that. It's about like the different colors of being brown and what that means, right? So I think there are more diverse children's books that speak to the experiences of different children that I think is also a great way to generate these conversations as well.
Good evening.
Hi.
Hi. I'm running for an office. I'm running for, and I'm the first woman, and the first woman of a person of color to ever run for Kalamazoo County Prosecutor's Office. And one of my challenges is, one of my issues is keeping the community safe and making sure people are accountable. And I talk about things like racial profiling, but some of that language
Right.
is a problem when I'm speaking to people who are white and not necessarily allies. So how would you advise me to, or any woman, to address that, or a person of color to address that in a diverse audience?
Yeah, thank you, and congratulations for running for office. It's great. So I think it's about I had that slide on switching language, and language of things like racial profiling are unfortunately trigger words that don't connect with particular audiences. The same with affirmative action. Those sorts of phrases have unfortunately become phrases that people have immediate emotional reactions to because they have again been used and racially coded for so many years in terms of political and media rhetoric. So oftentimes when talking about profiling, instead of using that language, perhaps trying to talk about it in terms of, we don't want particular people just to be targeted because of a characteristic that they have. And I think, again, examples work. So I often, I've seen advocates do this where it works when they say, for example, a Muslim woman in a hijab who is going through an airport, right, going through airport security, and she continually gets stopped. Even though nothing beeps as she goes through, there's no reason at all for her to be stopped and interrogated. And is that right? I mean, I think to pose that question to people is also okay, rather than to say, well, that's racial profiling or religious profiling and we should not do it, right? So to ask people, especially if it's like a situation where you're having a discussion, to ask people if that's right, and what is the impact of doing that, right? So that's one. A second is changing the language and not using the buzzwords that we react to. The second is honestly to use facts. I think that facts often help, and data and statistics. And so, for example, in the case of Muslim, Arab, South Asians, and Sikhs, we know that they get disproportionately stopped and profiled at airports all around the United States. And there are airport studies, for example, and stories just off the headlines, right? Like just recently, a young college student on a Southwest Airlines flight who was speaking in Arabic on the phone to his father was pulled off the flight for speaking in Arabic. I don't even know that the person knew it was Arabic, but it was a different language, foreign language, right? And so I think using stories and statistics to show that this is not just kind of happening here and there. It's actually something that's a pattern that has been happening to these communities also helps to persuade people. So I would say changing language, not using buzzwords, and using data, statistics to show that it's a pattern of injustice, and then using stories to kind of flesh those out, and asking people in the audience how they would respond. What are ways that we can ensure safety, as you said, without actually violating the civil rights of people?
So I wanted to just make a comment, and I don't know if you would agree with it or not, but I see more American policy toward refugees, and I'm speaking specifically about refugees, as having shut down and denying a lot of access to the United States. And I don't know if people are even aware of that. I mean, and that a lot of it is based on fear of Islamic culture. I mean, in the past, we were really open, and I guess I felt like you kind of made it sound like we're sort of this open country that welcomes foreigners, and we welcomed all the Vietnamese boat people and a lot of Cubans in the Mariel crisis and things like that. But with regard to Syrian refugees, for example, we've taken under 4,000, while Germany took 450,000. I mean, this has really been, we don't want Syrians in our country. After the French bombings or whatever, the attacks last fall, the United States, I think it was 31 governors said not in our state, including our own governor. So that's a really negative trend in the United States, and I don't know how much people are aware of that rather than being open to refugees, we have really shut down and created these refugee ceilings, especially against people from Muslim countries. So I just wanted to point that out.
You're absolutely right. And it's another example of the Islamophobia and the anti-immigrant sentiment coming together to play itself out. And when I said America is a leader when it comes to accepting immigrants, that's what we say that we are, right? And that is what the 1965 law actually intended to be. But we have really, over the past 25 years or so, gone backwards. Not just in accepting immigrants and refugees, but actually in the way that we treat immigrants and refugees living in the United States. And so immigration policy is devastating right now. I mean, you talked about Syrian refugees, and the reason we saw the pushback against Syrian refugees is that many of them are Muslim, right? And so the question constantly became, well, how can we assure that they're not going to harm us? Even though, again, there's data that says that there are no incidents of refugees actually creating any sort of national security threat in this country. And secondly, the United States has a significant system of assessing whether someone should actually come into the country or not as a refugee. But still, we saw the rhetoric. And that's what I think fans the flames of the fear and the insecurity. It's not based on data or facts. It's actually just based on creating this sense of fear and national insecurity. But the last thing I'll say is beyond Syrian refugees, I mean, the current situation of immigrants in this country is actually very dire. Under President Obama's administration, this government has deported more people in the history of this nation than at any other time in our nation's history. And at the moment, the administration is carrying out raids against Central American women and families, so young children being deported. So this should be a real concern to all of us, because it's happening in our neighborhoods and with families, people we go to, religious services with, or at schools. And it is another example of that racial anxiety and that anti-immigrant sentiment that we're seeing. So thank you for raising that.